Hey everyone, welcome to Zero Velocity Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe. This has been a long time coming. People have honestly been bugging me for about a decade to get into the podcast space, to start talking about isometric exercise, and today it happens. Today is the inaugural Zero Velocity Podcast. But before we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors. So Zenkai Sports, Kinvent, and obviously ISOPHIT for sponsoring this event and this podcast. Because if it wasn't for our sponsors, we wouldn't have been moving forward with this, well, really a thought process. And with zero velocity, it's not about not moving. So I want to clear this up right off the bat. It's about how you start moving and how you start moving better and, more importantly, pain-free. Because one of the root causes of pain and muscle and joint dysfunction, unfortunately, is movement. It's sport, it's exercise, and it's life. We've grown up understanding that the aging process is such that inevitably we're going to be in pain. In your 20s, you're fine. You're an Adonis. Virtually nothing can harm you. You're indestructible. Then you enter into your 30s, and this element of fear becomes prevalent. It's like, oh, I'm starting to notice some of my past choices and past decisions coming forward. They're starting to rear their ugly head. You're starting to spend money on therapeutic intervention. Our goal is basically to eliminate all of that. Our goal is to give you the tools, the knowledge, and the confidence that is necessary to make better decisions when it comes to your sport, exercise, and life training. Because what we don't want you to do is we don't want you to go down this rabbit hole of therapeutic intervention. It's expensive, and it's traditionally a road that you never get off of. And we can help with all of that basically stuff. So what our goal today, and really with this podcast, is to explore this untapped world of isometric-based strength training or exercise. I'll probably use those terms interchangeably throughout the entire podcast. And often I'll just simplify it by just calling it isometrics. Now, isometrics is basically an undiscussed topic in the world of physical health and sport performance training. And why is that? I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to go with the fact that it is traditionally not considered glamorous. It is considered, oh, you can do it anywhere. So my question to that would be, then why don't you? And if you're able to not really have it sort of sexy enough to sell, well, let's change that. Because there's a ton of people out there that are currently suffering because the way that we've promoted exercise and sport over the last 40 years has kind of led to where we are today. And that is either people not exercising, that is people exercising in pain and dysfunction, and unfortunately, if you have asymmetrical movement patterns, meaning right side doesn't move the same as the left side. Well, exercise will actually accelerate degenerative change. And in light of that, then you go, what do you mean? Exercise can accelerate degenerative change. I thought exercise was healthy. Well, it has the ability to be healthy. And the problem is you just don't know how to get that. You don't know how to access that health component. And yes, you can sort of sit there and go, yes, I run. Well, Roughly 87% of people that run end up in the hospital their first year of running. And that's admitted to hospital due to injury. So if health is an outcome, why are you going to the hospital? Not a good place to be. Weightlifting. It's great. It helps build muscles. There's many, many, many great attributes to lifting weight. And I highly recommend it once you're prepared. And we're going to touch upon all these things a little bit later. And then you look at health. Well, health, traditionally people are willing to spend, well, a lot of money when they get unhealthy. Our goal is to give you that knowledge so you don't have to spend that money way over here. And I'm not asking for a lot of money up front. I'm asking for your time, your ear, and your trust. Because I believe that we can make you live a healthier life by the information that we give you over the next 100, 200 episodes of Zero Velocity. Hold on, 100 to 200 episodes on one subject? You can talk about isometrics for 200 subjects? Well, I can, and I hope you can listen to it because we can talk about isometrics for tennis, we can talk about isometrics for concussions, we can talk about isometrics for back pain. And I'm skilled and knowledgeable in the area that I believe I can help pretty much all of you. And the diversity of my clients over the last 28 years has been enormous. Currently, some of the people I work with, double lung transplant recipient, kidney transplant recipient, turned into a diabetic. In 2 days of our advice, she reduced her insulin levels by half. 6 months later, she's basically reduced her blood pressure medication to almost zero. So if you're an able-bodied person dealing with some health issues, I believe we can help you as well. And we do, we help a lot of people. I have several people that I've worked with over the last couple of years basically get off of their blood pressure medication for hypertension. And traditionally, when you go on hypertensive medication, there's no exit strategy. It is, here you go, you're on this for life. And I'm not here to tell you not to take your medication. I'm telling you that in conjunction with working with your medical practitioners, the advice that I give you may lead to a reduction or a removal of your medication. And it's highly advisable to listen to your doctor. Listen to the metrics and make a rash and honest choice. Because one of our clients who was basically non-hypertensive continued on taking hypertension medication for another year and ended up in the hospital due to the complications of taking a medication he wasn't supposed to. Now that was because his doctor didn't believe the results he was seeing. And that's okay. Unfortunately, the gentleman suffered because of that indiscretion. However, with Isometrics, once again, it covers that health side. And it covers like little kids learning how to move. Right? We traditionally tell kids just to go play, just run around, and then they fall. And maybe they get injured in that fall. And then they have a fear of activity. And when you traumatize muscle tissue, it may lead to the tissue becoming inhibited, meaning it doesn't fire properly. And that muscle doesn't participate to the same level as it once did. So isometric exercise is a great way to reestablish that communication to that muscle, to bring it back online, to sort of say, hey, I want to stabilize my knee structure, because that's what muscles do. They stabilize your joint structures first. Secondly, they aid in locomotion, meaning movement. Now, so it goes from the health conscious to the children who are looking to engage in sport, exercise, and life. And then it goes through the teen years, right? As you're an adolescent and you're going through a growth spurt, isometrics may be super healthy for maintaining the integrity of that muscular structure, right? Because I deal with some of the world's elite volleyball players and basketball players, and these guys and girls are not your average height. They're average height for their sport, but some of them are approaching 7 feet tall and they're 14 years old. And applying big, huge loads might not be the appropriate place to start when they're prepubescent, even though they may look like men or women, but they're still developing. Their structures underneath are still developing. And then we jump over to the athletic world. Well, we have athletes using ISOPHIT that are currently going to the Olympics. We have ISOPHIT athletes that have won the World Series on 2 occasions, UFC titles. We have some, I believe, currently playing in the NBA championship. We've supported the men and women of the United States Army in the sense that they became a client. And more so because they started to adopt an isometric protocol due to the fact that they deemed it was safer for a lot of their soldiers when looking to develop muscle function, and more specifically for their testing protocol, like doing high rep crunches versus a sustained plank, is what they sort of started to explore isometrics for. Now, if we jump further into the rabbit hole, well, how can isometrics help with seniors? Wow, these are some of the most unstable, immobile people in all of humanity. We look at that is because, well, seniors tend to lose muscle. They tend to be less active. So why not start with a safer, more easily accessible approach to exercise? But we're just going to explore all this stuff today. So our goal with the podcast is to open your eyes. And that's really what it is. You guys can make your own decisions once you're given the knowledge. Now, I'm fortunate in the sense that I get to talk to PhD candidates, graduates, professors throughout the world who study isometric exercise. And I have access to world-class coaches. And the one thing that I've surmised from many of my conversations is that the world hasn't explored this area to an nth of the degree. If you do a kinesiology program, isometrics, for the most part, is less than a day of information on a 4-year program. The rest is dedicated to dynamic movement, which is great. We all move. It's very important. Now, one thing I want to differentiate when it comes to isometrics versus dynamics. Isometrics relates to not moving a joint. Dynamics means movement of joints, or a series of joints. So you could walk, or you could run, you can jump, you could play football, you could swim, you could play tennis. I don't care of the activity. It's dynamic in nature. Isometrics is about that joint not moving. Now let me be clear. It's not about the muscle not moving. The muscle moves in an isometric contraction. It shortens, right? So the muscle will shorten, the tendon will lengthen, so the total distance of what's called the musculotendinous structure doesn't change in length because that joint doesn't move. But the muscle itself can shrink or contract by up to 16%. And when you're looking at a series of a series of muscles within a position, there might be over 30 muscles moving, even though the joint didn't move. So that's hugely important for the people out there that go, oh, we're dynamic by nature, we have to move. Well, if you have to move, recognize that all you have to do to create a safer, more effective muscle contraction is maybe just move the joint angle and redo the isometric contraction, maybe over multiple angles over the position. So what I want to talk about today really is just give you an overview of what isometrics are, what an isometric contraction is, and then we're going to explore the topic of how it basically relates to sport, exercise, and life. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is an isometric? Well, an isometric muscle contraction, so first and foremost, there's three of them. So there's a concentric contraction. That's usually where you get a shortening or an approximation of a joint, right? So that's coming closer to that. So that's traditionally like a concentric. So on this, like for my knee, that would be this joint angle here, shortening that quad, and my other knee flexors would be doing that position. If I want to go for hamstring and my other knee flexors, it would be coming down. Okay, so that is kind of a concentric. It's basically the up force, right, where that muscle shortens. Eccentric is traditionally considered a lengthening of tissue. This one is still in the theoretical realm, so they're still trying to figure out why this occurs. They have some strong theories. They're throwing out words like tighten or titin, however you want to call it, and how it basically, as it lengthens, you're going to get muscle, like the actin and myosin cross-bridging sort of breaks a little bit. And basically, that pulls apart. The titin acts almost like an anchor, sort of grabbing on. It's like almost like throwing an anchor out of a rowboat as you're still trying to sort of row. It just slows you down. It's almost like a braking force. And then there's an isometric contraction. And an isometric contraction is where you basically get the actin and myosin cross-bridging, and that holds strong. And you can have movement within it. It's almost like two pieces of bamboo get stuck together. So you do have mobility within an isometric. It's not like totally rigid, where it's just like locked in and it's like I can't move. So these are some things that we got to think about. So if I'm looking to create a concentric movement, so let's say I want to move. The sequencing of a muscle contraction is such that an isometric muscle contraction will always go first. So your body creates tension within your structure, and then from there, then it's like the explosion. Then it's like, I'm going to all of a sudden move. It's like, cool, right? If you guys have ever watched one of the space shuttles take off, obviously I'm aging myself because the space shuttle program's been basically gone for a long period of time. Thank you, Elon Musk, by the way. And you look at it, what you're looking at is basically the rocket is held in space. So you have that isometric contraction. It's held, it's not moving. And then you have ignition. And then all of a sudden you're generating all this kind of force. And then it just sort of rises. Once you achieve a critical threshold that says the thrust overcomes the mass of the object, you then have liftoff. But until that point, you're generating all this massive amounts of energy. And that's what an isometric is. You're generating this amount of energy to create huge levels of muscle contraction force, right? And we, in the exercise world, we talk about this word power. And it's important in all sections of what we're going to talk about today. It's important for sport, it's important for exercise, and it's important for life. The two components that they use to construct basically a force velocity graph, well, I just gave you the answer. You got the vertical side, you got force, and along the bottom you always got velocity. Now you know why we talk about zero velocity. Because that's where force starts and is maximum. velocity starts here. So it really comes back to, how do you start generating muscle force to create movement? Now, we as humans get caught up in this word called time. Well, we think a second is not very long. But when you're looking at neurological activation of muscle tissues, things are firing in thousands of seconds. So a second is a really long time relative to the neurological activation of muscle inside us. So subconsciously, now here's an important thing to consider. I'm sitting here holding my body in space. I'm not doing all this dynamic stuff. So sitting requires a huge amount of isometric muscle endurance. Do I have that ability to stay contracted for a long period of time? Right, so if I start to explore this stuff and go, okay, well, if Isometrics fires first, it is responsible for maintaining my position within space so I can do dynamic stuff, right? Like, the rest of my body is not moving. I am currently choosing to move my shoulder joint, right? If I want to become argumentative and sort of say, well, it's more than my shoulder joint, it's my shoulder and my elbow joint, and it's my scapular joint or complex, which consists arguably of 5 or 7 joints, depending on the camp you belong to, because there's a couple floating joints in there of your thorax moving on your rib cage. Sure, we'll call that a joint. But the point is, the rest of the body didn't move. It generated force and held you in position isometrically. So that's a bench press, that's a squat, that's a deadlift, that's a bicep curl. That is all your traditional gym exercises. Because if you break the isometric component of the movement, they'll say that you cheated, your form was bad, and more importantly, it traditionally puts you at risk of injury because there's motion occurring that you didn't account for, right? And those are things that we need to explore. I did not say don't move. Please don't interpret what I said about isometrics as don't move. What I want you to understand is I want you to focus on your base of support. I want you to focus on the stuff that holds your form. I want you to focus on other things that may not be moving. Like, I want to tighten my abs, I want to drive my feet into the ground, I want to squeeze my bum, and then I want to push. Because if your goal is enhanced velocity, enhanced force output, having a stable structure is imperative. Right? Have you ever seen a 100-meter sprinter? They start with sprinting blocks. Why do they do that? So they generate huge amounts of force. If you want to reduce their speed, get rid of the sprinting blocks, and you'll see a drastic reduction of their ability to get off the starting line, because there's no force going back to generate force going forward. And yes, there is also a down force, but that's okay. So with isometric muscle contractions, it's basically learning how to hold the position, tensing the tissue, and as we discussed earlier, there is going to be a movement, right? So there's a shortening and almost a widening of that tissue. So in an isometric muscle contraction, the muscle itself does not work isometrically. The joint does. And you're going to have micro protuberations, which means there's going to be slight sliding, and that's fine. So you can make an argument that in that world, well, there's only going to be a specific amount of time within that time segment where that isometric contraction is occurring. That's fine. We're just going to accept the fact that if the joint is not moving and you're generating some muscle force, it's an isometric contraction. And then we start to explore that world of dynamics. Where does it fit in? It's like, okay, cool. So if we jump back to that power or that force velocity curve, we have force over here. So as soon as I move away from zero velocity, I'm now talking about the velocity spectrum, right? Hugely important. Need to talk about it. We'll just talk about, or let somebody else talk about that on a different show. Actually, we'll talk about it on our show too. And over here on that vertical axis, you got force. And what they actually mean is they mean isometric force. Why? Because that's zero. That's where you produce the maximum amount of force. And let me tell you that your isometric force output should, in theory, crush your dynamic output. Because once you get into this world of motion, it becomes extremely challenging to start orchestrating the complexity of motion, right? And movement is highly, highly, highly complex, right? If I took my knee and I'm just going to turn sideways, I'm just going to do a knee extension, right? So this movement here, right? So you're going to have multiple axes of motion within that movement. It's not I have a pin through here and it's just rotates around. It's called an instantaneous axis of rotation. So at moment A, B, C, D, E, and F, you're going to have basically multiple axes. So even though you're moving, that joint is basically that axis of motion is jumping around throughout your knee structure. And that's going to be the same at most of your joints depending on where you are within space. And that becomes complicated. And we then discuss one of the measures is torque, right, which is a rotational force. And what it is really it's the potential for rotational force. And it's measured isometrically. And that's crazy because people go, torque is about, like, I see it in my car, and it's about revolutions and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, yes, it's the potential, right? All you have to do is basically allow it to happen, and it will happen. But if you prevent it from happening, but as I said, they measure that isometrically. And we won't get into the equations and stuff like that because you don't really care today. You will later, and we'll start to explore the mechanics in different episodes and expand on the knowledge of isometrics. And we're going to dive right into that rabbit hole. And that rabbit hole is not only awesome, it's deep and wide and vast. And a couple other sort of choice words you can throw in there. But so you look at isometric from a muscle contraction, but we can also explore it from a movement type, right? So all of those other things that we discussed about isometric or dynamics, sorry, like, so you're looking at sprinting. Well, it starts isometrically. It really does. Olympic lifting, they start isometrics. And more importantly, if you don't finish in an isometric form, you get a failed lift. Oh, geez. So what I'm telling you is isometrics is hugely important for Olympic weightlifting. Yes, I am. And then you go, but it's all about force generation. It's about speed and acceleration and velocity. Yeah, those are components as well. But if you want to maximize it, add isometrics and perform your lifts. So dynamic exercise, and this is hugely important. Dynamic exercise does not allow you to prepare for movement. And I know that statement's going to be very controversial for a lot of you out there. Dynamic exercise does not allow you to prepare for movement. Why do I say that? Well, the reason I say that is because once you start to move, you're already moving. You're practicing movement. And if the goal is to prepare for movement, we have to explore a different option. And that option comes back to the world of isometrics. Isometric strength training, or isometric exercise, truly is the preparation for movement. It is learning how to generate force in the muscle, it's allowing you to adapt your neurological control to tissue. It is enhancing blood flow to muscle structure, tendon structure, ligamentous structure, bone structure in a very effective way. Right? And I know you guys are going to say bone doesn't have very efficient blood flow, and nor do tendons and ligaments. Well, you're right, it doesn't. But isometrics, they enhance blood flow to those tissues. And dynamic exercise, well, it doesn't really enhance it that much greater after you get to a peak, like almost like the threshold for isometrics. You get a little bit more stuff. But the problem is once you start moving, you lose the specificity of what you were trying to accomplish. It's kind of like if I'm sitting here and the camera's focused on me here, and I move here, and then I move back here, and then I move back over here, and you go, but I'm trying to focus on one thing. And my team behind the cameras are going like, what are you doing? They're jumping all over the place right now, and it's actually kind of funny to watch. But if you want to focus on something and you want to truly address it, and then move over and move forward. And it's all about sequencing. So I can train the dynamic realm easily. And this is a great segue into isometrics for sport. Because athletes, they're not normal. They really aren't. And when you get to a professional level, these are some of the world's greatest physical specimens. They have sacrificed most of their life to be great at one thing. And that is the skill of the activity that they chose to participate in. Now, you do have some true freaks of nature who can do multiple sports and do it exceptionally well. However, they're rare, so we're really not going to explore that level of extremism. We're going to talk about sport for the common man, the common woman, who wishes to basically just live a pain-free, high-performing, active lifestyle. So that's your recreational community, and maybe to a degree your master's level athlete. Also recognizing we can, in a moment's notice, discuss high-performance athletics. It's just basically the same concept phrased differently. But for today's segment, we're talking about the real human who is not that extreme freak of nature, who's not making millions of dollars. We're talking to you guys. And what we want to do is make your sport performance improved. Right? So whether it's golf, whether it's tennis, whether it's pickup hockey or rugby, or for the average runner, one thing that you have to look at is how did you prepare for your activity? Simply adding more repetitions to a high repetition scenario may lead to an overuse injury. It may lead to joint inflammation. It may lead to tendinitis or tendinosis, or it might just lead to a low-level chronic pain, right? You always have that nagging ache. So how do you fix it? Do you play more hockey? You know, if you're a hockey athlete, and you're sort of saying, hey, every time I go to rotate, my spine hurts. So why not add more spine rotation? To me, that doesn't sound like the best option. If you're a runner and you're dealing with sort of Achilles tendinitis and it's chronically inflamed, you could change the way you run. You can put in an orthotic to augment your foot structure and continue running on it. It may help a little bit, or maybe we teach you how to engage muscles that you may not know the names of, and we talk about how your tibialis posterior forms the arch of your foot, and this is how you access that tissue isometrically. So that way you can strategically increase the strength of the structure. So every time on impact, your foot actually absorbs and distributes force better versus let's just keep running on it. You know, let's put a wedge underneath it and change the forces going up my chain. And that's not necessarily a knock about orthotics. They do work, they do help a specific person. That may or may not be you, however. And when you're also looking at running as an activity, you have to question the appropriateness for a specific population. Let's call that population the obesity community, right? Individuals living with obesity. And it's not a knock on that population, but let's explore it for a second. So individuals who are obese have larger circumference measurements. When we're looking at running, we have to deal with rotational force. So if I'm now running, I have to rotate my mass, be it that girth in front of my spine, left and right. I have to start and stop. And if I'm a new runner, my skill is probably not the greatest. So traditionally with individuals with obesity, they have this mass here and they have weak posterior stabilizers, or the muscles on the backside of their body, and their stomach gets pulled forward. So it extends their spine a little bit. And when you have spinal extension, you have also what's called facet joint compression. And facet joints, they're small little things on the backside of your spine structure. And so you have spinous process coming back, and you have these transverse processes coming off to the sides. And on those backside of those transverse processes, you have what's called a facet joint. And that facet joint, you have a top or bottom, like on the bottom vertebrae, you have a top facet joint, and on the top vertebrae, you have a bottom facet joint. And they will compress into one another. And yes, there's some structures in between there that are supposed to shock absorb a little bit, but let's be honest, you're not that healthy of an individual, and you haven't prepared the tissue at all to tolerate the forces you're about to incur. So you got this, we'll use a guy as an example. We got this guy with big mass. So let's say he's got a 45-inch waist. So not the hugest, not the smallest guy on the planet, but what we were looking at is you got all this stuff rotating left and right. And what we need to do before we tell, let's give him a name too, so John. So before we tell John, the 45-year-old obese guy with a 45-inch waist, to go for a run, maybe, just maybe, we should discuss with John, how are you going to prepare the muscles so you can run pain-free, so you can burn more calories? Because let's say John had a 1 meter stride length, right? And John, he's new to exercise. He's like, I'm just gonna go for a kilometer, right? For my American friends, it's like 1,000 meters or 1,000 yards. And what we're looking at for John, he's new to this, and he's going, I got a 1 meter or a 1 yard length. Well, if I got a right side and I got a left side, and my stride length is 1 meter, that means he's gonna do 500 reps on his right side, 500 reps on his left side, and 1,000 rotations to his spine. His shoulders, same thing. He's gotta swing these bad boys as he runs. And he's gotta do this while the terrain is changing. If he's outside, if he's on a treadmill, hopefully that surface is stable enough, because different treadmills provide different levels of stability. So you have to start to think about some of these things. And so John, 45-year-old guy, goes, oh man, my ankles are sore, my knees are sore, my back is sore. So we've just quickly learned that John, the most appropriate place for him to start may have not been running. And you can regress all the way down and say, oh, just run 50 meters. But then you still got to look at all the forces associated with that. So it might not necessarily be advisable. So in this scenario, where does isometrics fit in? Well, maybe before John gets to running, we spend several months strengthening the muscle tissues that are associated with running. And we don't necessarily have to do that dynamically, because once again, there's huge skill involved in that equation, right? Squats are complicated, lunges are complicated. we're looking at bench press, they're complicated as well. And we have to look at that. So one thing that we need to now look at is like, what's a better option? So we'll look to isometrics as stabilizing the structures and getting them stronger. Tennis, same thing. We're going to be agile, we're going to move fast. So that means we have to learn how to start and stop our mass. And one thing we discussed earlier is muscles fire, or isometric muscle contractions fire first. And we also finish, right, with not moving. Now, during the transitional phase, so if I'm here and I go that way, and then I stop that way, I accelerate into an isometric contraction. Then I accelerate out, and then I come back. So in theory, in every cycle of a movement, an isometric contraction is the start, the end of that concentric phase, the start of the other phase out, right? And that's traditionally going from an eccentric back, because you have to get back to where you just came from, right? So it's the start, it's the transition, and it's the stop. And you can argue and say there's a double transition between the ending and the starting of the other movement, right? So really, it's 3 or 4 times every muscle contraction you have to engage in isometric contraction. So hugely important, right? So how does this now come into exercise? And we're cutting down the time because we can explore this, as I said, for hundreds of episodes. And this is truly just an overview. So with exercise, so you're new to exercise, or you're a seasoned exercise pro. So we can now sort of look at it and go, well, isometrics. So let's say you're a seasoned exercise pro. Let's start there. Wow, you have, basically you're going through a bench press and you notice that you always get to this joint angle you can't overcome. Well, traditionally they would say, hey, do some isometrics, and that will help you overcome that sticking point, right? You can be very, very neurologically specific, very muscularly specific to a position in space to overcome that obstacle of not being able to get through that range. What they really said was, throughout this range, you have different strength profiles, and when I hit this phase here, I am too weak to get through it. So what they do is they add an isometric control to work on positional strength, which is fantastic, highly recommended, totally works. Why don't we do that from the beginning of your exercise experience? So that way we can reduce the risk, we can actually accelerate the uploading of the motor control strategy. So if I did exercise 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could see how over 5 positions I went from here to here to here to here to here. Now, one of the things they like to talk about traditionally with isometric exercise is, hey, isometrics are the fastest, safest way for developing muscle strength, but they're only good for a specific joint position. Okay, cool. Well, if they're the fastest and safest way to develop muscle strength, end the sentence there, forget about the only joint position, and why not explore and utilize the fastest, safest way to get stronger? But they always throw in this little caveat, and I'm still searching for the source of where this started. It's in Super Training by Mel Stiff and a whole bunch of other books, but we're still trying to find who originally came up with this concept, a plus or minus 15-degree carryover of strength associated with an isometric. New research will sort of say that at a longer muscle length, well, it can be up to 40% increase in muscle strength. And then when you get into a shorter position, it's only about a 15-degree sort of carryover. That's fine, that's wonderful, but you got to consider, is the muscle length really the issue, or is it more other muscles participating at that joint position? Just something to think about. What is the relationship to all the other joint axes? Are there changes in what's called a moment arm? Another conversation, different day. Are there basically other considerations that we need to look at. Because traditionally, they're looking at a bicep curl, and they're going, well, when I'm up here, it's 15 degrees. When I'm down here, it's basically a 40 degrees. But the problem is, the bicep goes all the way back here. So you're not really at a longer length. Well, I guess technically you're longer than this, but it's not de-lengthened. So they don't really explore that. They basically look at the vertical upright component. Now, that's exercise. Now, if you're a newer exerciser and you don't know what to do from a motor control perspective, whether you're young, you're old, or just new to exercise. And currently, if you look at the stats, 6 out of 7 Americans do not belong to a gym. So I think there's something we are doing as an industry that is failing basically 6/7 of the American population. Either it's our messaging, maybe they don't necessarily feel comfortable going into a egocentric facility where it's glamorized by sexy machines, sexy mirrors, sexy lighting, and the individual themselves maybe have some self-conscious self-esteem issues in the sense that, well, I don't want to be around that. That can be inspiring, so don't get me wrong. And I'm certainly not hating on anybody. But what we have to look at is how do we make exercise easier to begin? Right? Where do we start? Right? Remember that the whole notion of this program is called zero velocity. That is where all movement starts. It doesn't matter if you're a professional athlete. It doesn't matter if you're a newbie to exercise. Movement starts at 0. And that is our goal. Right? So learning how to control movement patterns, the science will indicate isometric exercise produces a better result for teaching movement than movement itself. So if the goal is to teach motion, start with isometrics, pick multiple positions throughout a range, and learn how to orchestrate them. So own this one, own this one, own this one, own this one, then string them together. Right? The dynamic component is massively important. Now, how does this affect your life? Well, the natural tone of muscle tissue is isometric. Think about that. So if I'm sitting here, I'm not doing this as I showed you earlier. Now, that's a choice, and if I got good neural control, I could do that and look really good doing it. But for the general population, you sit at a desk all day, which is isometric. You drive in a car, which is isometrics. And then you go home and you sleep. But you don't sleep stacked up on top with your vertebral bodies like this. You now sleep sideways, for the most of you. And now you have what's called, so this is a compressive force to your spine, and then we're going to add shear force to your spine. And shear force is a force that crosses a structure. And when I add shear force to a structure, I have to think about, well, where's my hip position? Where's my head position? How thick am I? But if I don't have the ability to control not moving in, let's call it the frontal plane, this stuff, isometrically, because that's side lying, I may wake up with back pain. I may wake up with knee and groin pain. That first step of your day might really suck because all of a sudden you went from side lying all night with your foot not loaded to hello, good morning, first step. Your brain says, whoa, I was not prepared for that. So a simple technique you can do is just before you get out of bed, just create muscle tension throughout your whole structure. Right? Just squeeze everything. Don't hold your breath while doing it, but just tighten everything. Just sort of say, hey brain, let's talk to our muscles. They were sleeping for the last several hours. Right? But isometrics is huge. The science behind it is enormous. Things like blood pressure. The Mayo Clinic's come out in 2014 in one of their preceding papers, and stated that isometrics was superior to cardiovascular conditioning and resistance training for lowering blood pressure in a hypertensive population. So that's huge. So if you're wishing to avoid stroke and heart disease, the reduction of blood pressure is enormous. It's going to get rid of a lot of those risks, reduce a lot of those risks associated with those conditions. And One of the other things that you can look at, they're now exploring blood pressure and Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. So they're seeing individuals with higher levels of blood pressure, and poor circulation is really what it comes back to. They're now seeing influences of poor isometric strength in that population. It's also related to Parkinson's disease. So they've now started to see in adolescents, individuals with poor levels of isometric strength are at an increased risk. And we're talking 3 to 5%. So it's not an enormous perspective, but it is a risk factor. So if we can all of a sudden increase somebody's ability for their muscular system to fire better for a greater proportion of their life, it's just going to add huge, significant value and reduce that individual's risk of sustaining really one of the most undesirable health conditions you can get, be it a stroke, a heart attack, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease. And it stems also, like, how do your eyes function? Right? How's that natural gaze? Right? The natural gaze, when I'm looking at you guys, is isometrically held. So those 6 muscles within your eye structure are holding isometrically. Now, interesting research out of Johns Hopkins University in 2017, they started to see that the gaze was held in an isometric format, and then eye movement, obviously, is the dynamic realm. So different components of your brain are responsible for holding the gaze as well as creating the movement. So if you want to explore that a little bit further, they're now seeing that there's a whole different neurological looping mechanism to hold your body still in space, right? And they traditionally would have called that the subconscious, right? That involuntary muscle control. Maybe, just maybe, if we start to train that and we start to focus on that, we can enhance everything within our body, because we have that ability to pinpoint different tissues with isometrics. We can strategically grow bone with isometrics. So if you're looking to fight osteoporosis and osteopenia, you can strategically target bone growth. All you need to know is the joint position, the muscle you're looking to train, and how you apply force to that. Because once you start to move, unfortunately, it becomes guess, hope, and pray. I guess I'm targeting that. I hope I'm targeting that. I pray I'm targeting that. Versus, let's just start dictating the responses that we want. So, I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. Welcome on this journey. It's exciting, and we're just scratching the surface, and that was an hour. It was really, really exciting to unleash that knowledge. Hopefully you do something with it. Hopefully you watch next week. It's going to be a weekly show. So episode 2, we're going to explore isometrics for back pain. I believe it's 70% of the population, so 70% of the population will experience low back pain at some point in their life. Our goal is to have you not be one of them. And if you are one of them, we're going to show you some techniques that you can use, hopefully, to prevent you from having reoccurring back pain. Because if you've ever experienced back pain, it's debilitating, and it really influences the quality of your life. And our goal is to help you live a pain-free, high-performing, active lifestyle. So until next week, be well, focus on some isometrics, and if you like the show, drop some comments below, and tell your friends, tell your parents, everyone you know to stop by, check it out. We'll see you next week. Thank you.